Hello, everybody. Today we're reading a book called The Flight of Apollo 13, Lost in Space. Introducing Ken Mattingly, Gene Kranz, Maria Garza, Ramon Garza, and his friend Terry Urban. The astronauts, we have Jack Swigert, Jim Lovell, and Fred Heise. Right, chapter 1 is called The Fight. So we have a look over the side. In November 1969, I was 14 years old and living in Houston, Texas. How come you don't have a father, Ramondo? My name is Ramon, and my father was killed in Vietnam. Liar, he probably ran away to Mexico. Did not. I told you boys to stay away from each other. Now you're both in trouble. Okay, chapter 1. Later that day, my mother and I sat in Principal Morgan's office. Mrs. Garza, this is the third time Ramon has been caught fighting in the last 2 months, he said, and his grades are dropping. My teacher, Mrs. Morales, added, he used to be an A and B student. Now if he gets a C, it's a miracle. It's been a rough time for Ramon, said my mother, and for me. My husband was killed in Vietnam last year. I just sat there silently. I have received permission to have Ramon come to my work after school, she continued. I'll make sure his grades and his attitude improve. My mother, Maria, worked for NASA at the Johnson Space Center. She wasn't an engineer or a scientist or an astronaut. She was a food service worker and ran the cafeteria where the engineers, scientists, and astronauts came to eat. That, I thought, was a nothing job. She was serious, so every day I took the bus to Johnson Space Center to do my homework and to work. It was a nothing job. I had to take food orders from people with real jobs and help clean the cafeteria. I hated working at the Space Center. I was sure everyone thought I was there because I was a troublemaker. But people smiled and pronounced my name correctly. After a while, I began to take interest in my work. I even started to take an interest in the space program. One January afternoon, I was sitting in my mother's cafeteria and having difficulty with a math problem. I asked my mother, can you help me with this long division? When I'm finished my work, Ramon, she answered. Maybe I can help, came a man's voice. I looked up to see the face of Captain Jim Lovell. He was an astronaut who'd been on several Gemini missions, the command module pilot on Apollo 8, and now commander of Apollo 13. Soon he would walk on the moon. Now let's see, he said. He sat down next to me and looked at the problem. 156 divided by 12. How many times does 12 go into 15, Ramon? Once, I replied, feeling kind of stupid. I wished I didn't need the help. Mark it down, he said. Now subtract 12 from 15, and you come up with what? 3, I said. Okay, Lovell continued. Bring down the 6, and you have 36, I said excitedly. Divide that by 12, and I have 13. That's right. You're pretty sharp, Ramon. Do you like math? It's okay, but I like science more. Me too. I have trouble with math from time to time. You do? Is math important if you want to be an astronaut? Do you want to be an astronaut? I want to be a Marine. My dad was a Marine, but he was killed in Vietnam. I'm sorry to hear that. I lost my dad when I was a kid too. You know, Ramon, he said, it's not impossible to be a Marine and an astronaut at the same time. John Glenn was a Marine. My crewmate, Fred Heise, served with the Marines too. Walt Cunningham, Vance Brand, and Cliff Williams are all Marines and astronauts. I'll bet that's hard, I said. Well, you have to go to college and study math, science, and aeronautics, Lovell said. You have to learn how to fly and operate a jet. Flying a jet would be cool, I said. Lovell smiled. Yep, but NASA needs doctors, teachers, and scientists in the space program as well. It all requires study, and above all, bravery. Bravery? My dad was brave, but he never got the chance to go to college. I would. I would become a marine flyer and an astronaut. I'd show those kids at school. After that, Captain Lovell must have spoken to the crew of Apollo 13. In the weeks that followed, he or Fred Hayes or Ken Mattingly would stop by and help me with my science or math. One day in March, Eugene Kranz, the flight director, came with them. It was amazing to have these men sitting at the table helping me with my homework. Your mother tells me tomorrow's your 15th birthday. How would you like a private tour of Mission Control? I couldn't contain my excitement. Yes! That night, I couldn't sleep. I gazed out the window at the moon. It seemed so bright and close. Commander Lovell had told me that the moon was more than 200,000 miles from the Earth. It would take Apollo 13, 5 days to get there. Ramon, turn off the light, my mother called. Tomorrow's a big day. I awoke the next morning, glared at the clock, and wolfed down my breakfast. Ken Mattingly had volunteered to pick me up in 10 minutes. Ken had a great sports car, and we sped to the manned spacecraft center. I'll bet you're anxious to pilot the command module, I said. I sure am, Ken replied. I've been training for a long time. I was lucky to be chosen for the space program. It was more than luck to be chosen. An astronaut had to be one of the top pilots at Mission Control. Even for a Saturday, there was lots of activity. Technicians were checking their computers. In a few weeks, Apollo 13 would launch for the moon. Gene Kranz's station as a flight director was near the top of the center. Behind him was a glassed-in viewing area for VIPs, astronauts, families, and NASA officials. Whoa, what's all this stuff, Mr. Kranz? From here, we monitor the spacecraft and the astronauts' health with radio telemetry. What does that mean? Radio signals from onboard computers send a message back here for our scientists. It's like radio communications. Exactly. Just then, a man came into the huge room. Mr. Kranz called him over and then introduced him. Ramon, this is Jack Swigert, he said. Jack is Ken Mattingly's backup on Apollo 13. We shook hands. Your mother's Miss Maria Garza, right? Swigert said. She is a great woman. You should be proud. A great woman? I never thought of her that way. She worked in the cafeteria. But maybe her job was important after all. It was NASA's cafeteria. Everyone there was part of an historic project. Jack, Mr. Kranz said, why don't you take Ramon to see the capsule simulators? We drove over in Mr. Swigert's car, and he told me how he became an astronaut. The more I heard from the astronauts, the more I understood how hard it would be to become one of them. At the capsule simulator. Crawl in the command capsule. Really? There sure are a lot of controls. There are indeed. 40% of our training is learning how to use the spacecraft navigation systems. I could never learn all these buttons. Sure you can, kid. It just takes time and a little practice. Chapter 2. The mission begins. April was a busy month for the Apollo crew. Eventually, they left for Cape Kennedy in Florida, which is now called Cape Canaveral. The huge Saturn V rocket was there, waiting to send the astronauts into space. I missed their help with my homework, but to tell the truth, I was doing pretty well on my own. Sometimes I'd take box lunches up to Mission Control and watch the preparations from behind the glass of the VIP room. I didn't really understand it all, but I caught the excitement going on in front of me. A few days before the launch, Ken Mattingly received some bad news. He had been exposed to the German measles. Rather than taking a chance that he'd get sick in space, NASA replaced him with his backup, Jack Swigert, as command capsule pilot. Ken felt terrible. Captain Lovell argued with the doctors and told them that the measles weren't that serious. Lovell said that if Ken came down with him, he and Fred Hayes could bring the spacecraft home. The doctors, however, weren't going to take any risks. I was in the cafeteria when Ken and Mr. Kranz walked in. "Hi, Mr. Kranz." "Hi, Ken." "I'm sorry about you being replaced," I said softly. Ken patted my shoulder. "Thanks, kid. There will be other space flights." But I could tell he was disappointed. Then Mr. Kranz stared at me. "You still don't look happy, Ramon. What's the matter? Tough homework?" "He wants to watch the launch, but there's no way I can take him." "How about the next best thing?" "What's that?" "How would you like to watch the launch from Mission Control?" "Wow! May I, Mum?" I asked. She smiled. "Yes, if you promise to stay out of the way," she said. "I promise," I exclaimed. Saturday, April 11, 1970. I was up at dawn, checking my model of the Saturn V rocket and the parts of the Apollo spacecraft. First, there was Odyssey, the command module where the crew would spend most of their time on the flight. Second, the service module, which contained the oxygen, water, and power. Finally, there was Aquarius, the lunar module, which would take Lovell and Hayes to the surface of the moon. I took the bus to the Johnson Space Center and arrived at 10 that morning. Only a few people were in the VIP room. The real action was in the main room called Mission Control. A package arrived for Gene Kranz. It was a white vest with the Apollo logo on it. Mr. Kranz always wore a vest during a launch. The men in the control center began to applaud, and I heard a few whistles. Gene Kranz began to call out to the stations. "Boosters, retro, guidance, surgeon," he said. Moments later, launch control. "This is Houston. We are go for launch. Ignition. The clock is running. We have liftoff. Wow. Houston, we have cleared the tower at 1313. Someone called over the loudspeaker. "Okay, guys, we got it," Kranz answered. Then I heard Jim Lovell over the astronaut speaker, called the squawk box. "Houston, we've got a center engine cut off." "We're still go," the flight officer said. "We'll be all right as long as we don't lose another one. The other engines are good, so we're going to burn them for a little bit longer," the capsule communication officer told the crew. I was worried about all of the commotion, but one of the engineers was sitting next to me. "It's routine from here on, kid," he said. "No worries." The situation might have been routine for him, but it sure wasn't for me. This was the most exciting thing I'd ever seen. These men were on their way to the moon. Before the crew could travel to the moon, they had to pick up the LM, or lunar module, that was stored in the third stage of the Saturn rocket. That was Jack Swigert's job. First, Jack had to separate the command module, or CM, from the third stage. That went very smoothly. Then he had to line up on the LM. This was a tricky operation, but Jack was an excellent pilot. From the squawk box, I heard Fred Hayes call out the distance as Jack lined up. 40 feet, 20, 10, capture, he exclaimed. "Houston, we have hard dock," said Jack. "Roger," replied Mission Control. Fred's voice called out, "Okay, Houston, we have LM extraction." "Like I said, Ramon, routine," the engineer said. He smiled and left the room. I sat there for a long time watching and listening to the action. I'm not sure how late it was, but there was a shift change in Mission Control. Then I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Time to go home, Ramon. But if something exciting happens..." "The most dangerous part is over, Ramon. We'll be back tomorrow." The next day, after church, I went to my room and turned on my NASA squawk box. Ken Mattingly had installed the radio in our house. What I heard was mostly course corrections and what I thought at the time was busy work. I hadn't realized then that all the things the crew had to do were to keep the spacecraft flying. School the next day dragged by. The crew was going to broadcast that evening from space, and I wanted to watch it. When I go to NASA, I heard someone say, the TV networks aren't going to broadcast the crew. Mum, I called to her, can we stay and watch them? Did you finish your homework? She asked. Of course, I replied. I know she expected a different answer. That night on the spacecraft. Okay, we'll start out in Spaceship Odyssey and then take you through the tunnel to Aquarius. In less than 2 days, I'll land this tiny spacecraft on the moon. Why isn't anyone else here to watch, Mum? I guess we've all seen it before. How could anyone get tired of this? This is the crew of Apollo 13, wishing everyone a nice evening. Just before they signed off, we heard a huge bang. Jim Lovell said, Houston, that bang you heard was Fred Heiss on the cabin repress valve. He really gets our hearts going with that one every time. Fred liked to kid around. Our next broadcast will be from Morrow on the surface of the moon, Jim said. Fra Morrow was a region of hills the scientists had chosen the area for a landing because they thought the hills had been created by volcanoes. Moon scientists get all excited about volcanoes. I got up and stretched. Thanks, Mum, for letting me come, I said. We better get ready to go home, she said. Okay, I said, but I want to thank Mr. Kranz first. I walked out of the room, then I heard one of the controllers say, give the oxygen tanks a stir. Then suddenly, bang! What was that, Jack? Okay, Houston, we have a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please. Is something wrong? Houston, we've had a problem. Houston, we are venting something into space. It's a gas of some sort. We've got more than a problem. We've lost tank 2 pressure. What's that mean? They're losing oxygen, kid. Everyone, keep cool. Let's not do anything that's going to blow our electrical power. In a few minutes, Jack Swigert said, are you copying O2 tank 1 pressure? That's affirmative, someone said at mission control. The tank was losing oxygen. Another man stood up and said to Gene Kranz, I want to shut off the reactant valves, starting with fuel cell 3 first, to see if we can stop the flows. Once the valves shut down, they couldn't be reopened. That meant Apollo 13 couldn't complete its mission. You could feel the disappointment in the room on the spacecraft when they were told to shut the valves. Fred Hayes said, did I hear you right? You want me to shut the react valve on fuel cell 3? That's affirmative, came the reply. It's over, Jim Lovell said with a sigh. We're not going to the moon. Okay, carrying on. Then the news came that shutting down the valve didn't stop the oxygen from leaking into space. They shut down the tank number 1, but got the same result. How would the astronauts be able to breathe, I wondered. The men of mission control thought of putting the crew into the lunar module. It had its own oxygen supplies. That's what we're thinking too, Jim replied. Are they going to die? I wondered. These were my friends. I lost my father. Now I was going to lose these men too. Ramon, I felt my mother's touch. It's very late. We must leave, she said. But Mum, what about Mr. Lovell and the crew? There is nothing we can do, she said. When we arrived home, I ran into my room and turned on the squawk box. I'm sure my mother knew I was listening, but she left me alone. At Mission Control, Mr. Kranz's team was turning control over to Glenn Lunny's team of controllers. I heard Lunny say, "Get them into the LM. We've got to get the oxygen on." "Houston," Jim Lovell called. "I've got some numbers for you, but I want you to double-check my arithmetic so far." Jim told me he had trouble with math. The math had to be just right, or they were finished. This time, adding up the numbers meant life or death. Jim called out the numbers, and then there was silence. I'm sure the men inside Apollo 13 were holding their breaths, hearts pounding. Then Lusma came on. "Okay, Aquarius, your arithmetic looks good." "Okay," Jim said after a while. "Aquarius is up and Odyssey is completely powered down." "Roger," Lusma replied. I heard Jim say, "Is there any way I can control this thing? I want to get out of this role." "It doesn't matter where you go," Mission Control replied. "Are we still leaking oxygen?" Jim asked. "We're not," they said. I sat on the edge of my bed. Jim Lovell was a great pilot, but if he couldn't get the ship under control, they wouldn't be able to get home. That night, we listened to the news reports. "It is only by a narrow margin that we're going to get Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert back alive." "Do you think they'll make it, Mum?" "Those men are very good at what they do. Together they will find a way to get home safely." "That's what I said about Papa." I know. I went back to my room and lay on my bed. Then I heard Jack Lusma's voice over the squawk box. "Aquarius, we'd like to brief you on what our burn plan is." He explained that they would fire engines on Aquarius to slingshot their craft around the moon and send it to Earth. A little later, Fred said, "So long, Earth, catch you on the flip side," and Apollo 13 disappeared around the dark side of the moon. Many of the kids at school had parents who worked at the Johnson Space Center, so the TVs were on in the classrooms. We waited and watched, hoping Apollo 13 would circle the moon and head home for Earth. Fred Heiss had told me that the rockets on Aquarius were for lunar landing or takeoff. They weren't designed to steer the whole spacecraft. Apollo 13 has rounded the moon and is on a trajectory for Earth, we heard TV report. We cheered, still, everyone worried, except, of course, for Terry Urban. Mr. Morales calmed the class. "Ramon, what do you think? A few months ago, I would have met Terry after school and gotten into a fight. If Terry could see the activity and worry about mission control, he would know that this isn't a hoax." I nearly shouted. "I've seen the controllers and the others working at night and day to bring those men back." "Yeah, well, I'd like to see that myself to believe it," said Terry. "Then maybe you should," I said. "Come with me and I'll prove it." Mr. Morales smiled. "Okay," Terry said, "but I'll bet those buildings are fake too." After school, Terry and I boarded the bus for the Space Center. "My folks were so mad at me for fighting that they grounded me for months," said Terry. "I guess when Mr. Morales told them that this would be a good learning experience, they agreed to let me come with you." "It'll be worth it," I said. "But I really came because I want to see for myself how fake the whole thing is," he said. When we entered the center, Terry's eyes grew wide. I knew he might be rethinking his ideas. Then Jim Kranz spotted me. I took Terry over to meet him. "Nice to meet you, Terry. Are you here to help?" "Yes, sir." "You have a good friend in Ramon. He's part of the team, trying to bring the astronauts home." "Wow. Come on, Terry. We have to bring meals to the guys in the simulators." My cousin said the whole thing was filmed in the simulators. Ha, just wait. We entered Building 5 and brought the food to the men working on the simulators. "We did it. I heard John Aaron say. By running the battery from the LM to the CM, we can give them enough power. You could feel the excitement in the room. Even Terry smiled. Terry and I caught a ride back to Mission Control, and we went to the VIP room. I could see how excited Terry had become. This is cool. The control room suddenly grew quiet. Time for a mid-course burn. To fire the LM's engine, Jim had to line up the Earth to navigate. Jack, Jim told Swigert, you time the burn with your watch. We're firing for 14 seconds. Fred, you grab the altitude controller, said Lovell. I'll handle pitch and roll and take care of ignitions and shutdown. Chapter 5. Splashdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Roger, shut down. Good burn, Aquarius. Shut down, Houston. Burn complete. They're really up there, aren't they? They sure are. The next day, Thursday, April the 16th, was very tense at school. We learned Fred Hayes was running a fever, and he had the rest of the crew hadn't been drinking enough water. After school, Terry and I returned to the Space Center to learn some more bad news. We listened as the Capcom called Apollo. You're coming in on a slightly shallow flight path, he said. What does that mean? Terry asked. It means they might hit the atmosphere and bounce back into space, I answered. Can they try again? He asked. No, I replied. They only have one chance. Terry stayed at my place that night. I turned on the squawk box. Ken Mattingly was reading instructions to the crew. We did run simulators on all of this, so we think we got all the little surprises ironed out. I hope so, because tomorrow is examination time. I didn't realize how much they had to do. Scary, isn't it? School closed on Friday. The world was watching. Terry and I watched at Mission Control. You could feel the tension. Terry and I kept very quiet as we passed out coffee. Gene Kranz was in charge once again. Jim fired the jets on Aquarius for a last course correction. Now it was time to separate the damaged service module. When you jettison the service module, Jim said, and Fred, stay in the LM. And Mission Control, Jack, go to the CM. Just before you separate, Jim will fire the LM thrusters, pushing the craft forward. Jack will cut the service module. When do you want to do this? Fred asked. Time is not critical, Mission Control replied. The astronauts went to their stations. I was so nervous. I spilled Mr. Kranz's coffee on my shirt. Then Jim called, Jack, are you ready? All set, said Mission Control. When you feel the motion, let her go, the controller added. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Jack sang up. Jettison. Maneuver complete, said Mission Control. I looked at Terry and smiled with relief. Now it was time to power up the Odyssey. If those electric panels are wet from the cold air, when Jack throws those switches, I whispered to Terry, they'll start a fire. As Jack fired up the CM, we held our breath. Okay, Houston, Jim called. I'm at the LM separation altitude, ready to bail out. Once the men were all in Odyssey, Jack flipped a switch and called LM jettison complete. Now they only have that little capsule to get them back to Earth, I said. Gene Kranz ran a check on all the controller stations. Each controller answered with a go. Capcom relayed the message. We'll have a loss of signal in about a minute. The speed of the re-entry would cause the astronauts to black out for a few minutes. We waited to hear from Odyssey. What if the heat shield fails? I wondered under my breath. They'd burn up. We'd know in 3 minutes. No crew had ever taken longer than 3 minutes to emerge from a blackout. 3 minutes dragged slowly by, and we heard nothing. Then 4 minutes. I bit my lip to stop myself yelling. Terry was squeezing his eyes shut, but I could see his tears. Odyssey, Houston, standing by. Over. 15 seconds past. Houston, standing by. Over. 30 seconds. Nothing but static. We're okay. In the end, the crew was safe. Soon they were picked up by a helicopter and taken to the deck of a carrier ship. It was great watching Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert step onto the deck of that ship. Later, investigators discovered that the oxygen tank had been faulty and that the men could not have prevented the accident. Some say Apollo 13 was a disaster. I say it was a triumph of science, engineering, and hard work, along with bravery that brought the crew home. As for me, I studied hard, graduated from the Naval Academy, and became a Marine flyer, and eventually joined NASA. I flew a number of space shuttle missions. Terry Urban became a flight surgeon and flew on shuttle missions too. We still joke about how we fought. The end.